Salam alaikum, malaikum salam. We are reading tonight African Kingdoms of the Past, Congo and Dongo, West Central Africa. And we're reading a part in the book where it speaks about black gold. As in many other parts of Africa, slavery was common in the Kingdom of Congo. Slaves were usually war captives, criminals, or other undesirables. Sometimes people will pawn themselves or a relative into slavery to pay off a debt. Slaves usually worked as soldiers, laborers, or domestic servants. In many cases, because they were politically neutral and had lost their tribal ties, slaves were useful in government and could attain highly responsible positions in Congo. They might be messengers, nobles, and trusted merchants trading for their master. Slaves in Africa were usually not far removed from their homeland. They were largely familiar with the country that had enslaved them. Their labor benefited the local African economy, and they could marry, own property, and often buy, otherwise earn their freedom. This was a very different system from the type of slavery established by the Portuguese soon after the exploration of the West African coast had begun. The beginnings. In 1415, Prince Henry of Portugal, known as Henry the Navigator, had been a crusader in the North African Muslim port city of Ceuta. There he saw camel caravans arrive, heavily laden with gold. Where did the gold come from? The prince inquired. From the fabulous wealthy kingdom of Mali, south of the Sahara, he was told. Prince Henry determined to find the source of this African gold by sailing down the west coast of the continent. At this time, the Europeans had also developed a taste for sugar, which had fetched top prices ever since crusaders in the Middle East tasted it for the first time. So the Portuguese were also searching for tropical islands like Madeira, far off the western coast of present-day Morocco, where sugarcane could be grown. In the Ages, the European economy had been mostly based on spices and other rare goods obtained from the Far East. The trade routes passed over land and by sea from China and Malaysia via India, converging on the city of Constantinople and Istanbul. In 1453, the vital link between Europe and the East, fell to the Turks. The trade routes were closed to the European merchants, and the prices of goods skyrocketed. Now, Europeans searched not only for gold and new land suitable for planting sugarcane, but also for new routes to the east. These factors were the catalysts that triggered the explosive age of exploration. The Italian explorer Christopher Columbus thought he could reach the east by sailing west, but the Portuguese believed that they might reach the east by sailing around Africa to India. The journey around Africa had never before been attempted. How big was Africa? How long the voyage would take? No one knew, but the lure of gold, new sugar plantations, and great profits to be made from trade with India and China was irresistible. Starting around 1419, Prince Henry financed one voyage after another. By 1433, he had sent 15 expeditions down Africa's northwest coast, but each turned back at the infamous Cape Bojador. They were afraid to continue, for it was said, beyond this cape there is no race of men, nor place, or inhabitants, while the currents of the water are so terrible that no ship having once passed will ever be able to return. At last, in 1434, a captain named Gil Enanes, which they say here his name was Zel Enanes, rounded the cape and landed on African coast. The spell was broken, and now each new voyage ventured farther south. In 1442, a few West Africans were captured as souvenirs and taken to Lisbon. It soon became fashionable for middle and upper class Europeans to own black servants, and over the next 60 years, the slow trickle of slaves from West Africa to Europe became a flood. By 1550, African slaves made up at least 10% of the population of Lisbon. While the Portuguese had not come to Africa in search for slavery, they were familiar with the practice of slavery. In fact, European merchants used slaves from North Africa and Russia to work sugar plantations on various Mediterranean islands. The uninhabited island of Principe and Sao Tome of Central West Africa coast turned out to be perfect for growing sugarcane. To the Portuguese, it was logical to use slave capture from the mainland to work these new plantations. And once Columbus had reached the Americas in 1492, it was a further logical step to establish the Portuguese plantation system in the New World. By 1482, gold and slaves were being exported from the Portuguese trading fort of Elmina on the Gold Coast, Ghana. Diego Cao had reached the mouth of Zaire River. Only 5 years later, Bartolome Diaz reached the Cape of Good Hope, and in 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape and sailed for Calicut in India. The Portuguese had found their African gold. They have found island for their sugar plantations, and they have found their trade route to the east. On the way there, they discovered a trade that was to prove more lucrative than gold. Sugar or spices, the slave trade so profitable that its human cargo came to be called black gold. Salam alaikum, malaikum salam. Unbelievable. Crazy the way they called it black gold. Wow. Have a great night.